Have you taken leave of your senses? The whisper coiled behind him, sharp as a snake in the dust. But Elias Thorne gave no sign he'd heard. His gaze was fixed, an anchor in the swirling tide of the auction yard, upon the three women who stood caged behind rust-pitted iron bars. A perimeter of fear had formed around them. The crowd shrank from their earthen-hued garments, the sinewy strength in their frames, and a look in their eyes that held the glint of ancient, untamed things. But Elias saw what they missed. Hanging from the neck of each, faded yet unmistakable, were talismans of woven fur and bushy gray squirrel tails. 5 years. It had been 5 years since he'd last seen their like. Not in a marketplace, not in bondage, but in the deep, dripping heart of the forest in the aftermath of the Great Flood. He had been a boy then, clinging to a splintered plank as if it were life itself, half drowned, bleeding, and utterly certain of his own demise. But hands had pulled him from the churning water. He remembered their callous strength, the heat of a fire that pushed back the encroaching dark, and the unnerving silent watch of three women who spoke a language of gestures and herbs. When he finally awoke with a clear head, they were gone, but the image of those squirrel-tailed totems had remained etched in his mind, a wisp of smoke that would not dissipate. And now, here before him, was the impossible proof of their existence. The auctioneer, a man with sweat stains blooming on his collar, barked a preposterously high price. The crowd jeered. Not a single hand was raised. The women remained as they were, silent, statuesque, their pride a shield against the jeering mob. Without a moment's hesitation, Elias unhooked the gold pocket watch from his waistcoat, the final heirloom from his father. He held it aloft, the metal catching the afternoon sun. "I will take them," he declared, his voice cutting through the noise. He was not purchasing souls that day. He was settling a covenant with fate, a debt of life that had remained unpaid until this very moment. This is a story not merely of survival, but of a legacy forged in water and fire, of a loyalty that transcends language, and of the sacred mysteries that bind our present to our past. 5 years prior, the storm had descended not with a warning, but with a vengeance. The sky had turned a bruised purple, the wind shrieked like grieving spirits, and the river that bordered Thorne Ranch became a ravenous beast devouring its own banks. Elias had been struggling through the rising torrent, his father a dead weight upon his shoulder, groaning from the sharp kick of a panicked stallion. He had barely managed to drag him to the relative safety of the barn's high ground when the corral fence splintered like matchwood. A single misstep, and the earth dissolved beneath his feet. The river's maw opened and swallowed him whole before a scream could form in his throat. What came after was a fever dream of churning water and splintered wood, a disorienting dance of mud and sky. He clung to a length of floating timber, the sole barrier between himself and oblivion. For what felt like an eternity, hours or perhaps days, the world was a sickening cycle of relentless sun, chilling rain, and the deafening roar of the flood. He lost consciousness on the second night, a husk of a man, parched, starved, and his leg torn open by a snag of barbed wire. When his eyes fluttered open again, it was to the sight of a dense forest canopy. He lay in a sheltered hollow beside a crackling fire, his wounded leg expertly bound in a poultice of crushed herbs and woven bark, a heavy hide draped over his shivering body. He could not decipher the guttural, soft-spoken words they exchanged, but he understood the language of their hands, firm, practiced, and devoid of malice. 3 figures attended to him in a silent rotation. One foraged for medicinal plants, her fingers stained with earth. Another patiently spoon-fed him a warm, savory broth from a bowl of carved wood. The third, the tallest of them, simply watched him with a quiet, contemplative intensity. Their care was efficient, not sentimental. Perhaps they sensed he was a creature of a different world, one he must return to. One morning, as a thick fog clung to the forest floor and a measure of strength had returned to his limbs, they led him, blindfolded, to a fork in a now tranquil river, pointed him toward the south, and melted back into the trees before he could utter a single word of thanks. No one had believed his tale when he finally staggered home. No one had ever heard of such a tribe. The squirrel-tail talismans he so vividly described were dismissed as the fevered imaginings of a half-drowned boy. The notion of 3 women, stronger than most men, nursing a rancher's son back to health was pure fantasy. His ordeal became a local legend, a ghost story, until the day of the slave auction. That single moment resurrected it all. The memory of their stoic faces, the comfort in their shared silence, the defiant way they had stood at the forest edge as they left him, like ancient guardians dissolving back into myth. And now, 5 years on, they had been dragged from their world into his, shackled and treated as chattel. The sheer profanity of it churned in his gut. His actions that day were not born of pity, but of a primal instinct, something deeper and more potent than simple memory. As he drove them back to the ranch in his wagon, the silence was a heavy blanket over them all. The journey was arduous, over winding, rutted tracks and steep rocky inclines. They sat in the wagon bed, unmoving, their wrists chafed and raw from the iron manacles. Elias resisted the urge to look back at them, unsure if any flicker of recognition existed in their eyes. He wasn't even certain they were the same women, but he knew those talismans, and he knew that the threads of their destinies were not yet fully woven. At the ranch, he led them to a small empty cabin by the hay barn, used the tools in his shed to break the chains himself, and then left them in peace. He did not expect gratitude, he simply waited. For days they remained secluded in the cabin, their low whispers of foreign melody on the wind. They kept to themselves, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if it were expecting it to rise up and consume them. But on the 5th evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and rose, and the horses stirred dust in the corral, one of them, the tall one with the braided hair and the thin, faded scar that bisected her left eyebrow, walked to his porch. In her hand she held a small piece of bone, intricately carved. She placed it on the wooden planks without a word, then retreated a few steps. Elias picked it up. It was shaped like the fork in the river. He looked at her, and she gave a single deliberate nod. The past had returned. The following morning, Elias rose before dawn. A fundamental shift had occurred within him. The carved bone now hung from a peg above his hearth, a stark reminder that the past he had thought buried was merely dormant. As he stepped into the cool morning air, he found the 3 women waiting in the yard. The timidity was gone. They were clad in the same strange, functional attire of leather, bone, and cloth, dyed in deep, earthy tones. The stockiest of the 3 leaned on a long, unadorned staff, while the youngest, whose amber eyes seemed to pierce right through him, clutched a bundle wrapped in deerskin. It was the tall one, the one with the scar and the faded scar that bisected her left eyebrow, walked to his porch. In her hand she held a small piece of bone, intricately carved. She placed it on the wooden planks without a word, then retreated a few steps. Elias picked it up. It was shaped like the fork in the river. He looked at her, and she gave a single, deliberate nod. The past had returned. The following morning, Elias rose before dawn. A fundamental shift had occurred within him. The carved bone now hung from a peg above his hearth, a stark reminder that the past he had thought buried was merely dormant. As he stepped into the cool morning air, he found the 3 women waiting in the yard. The timidity was gone. They were clad in the same strange, functional attire of leather, bone, and cloth dyed in deep, earthy tones. The stockiest of the 3 leaned on a long, unadorned staff, while the youngest, whose amber eyes seemed to pierce right through him, clutched a bundle wrapped in deerskin. It was the tall one, the one with the scar, who stepped forward. She spoke, her voice low and resonant in a language he could not comprehend, but the gestures she made were universally clear. She pointed to the carved bone hanging over his door, then to her own heart, and finally out toward the distant, misty mountains. She remembered. They all did, and they required his aid. Elias asked no questions, not then. He simply began to prepare. He gathered supplies, cured meat, water skins, flint and steel, his long rifle and 2 revolvers. He saddled his mare, a spirited Mustang named Belle, and hitched a second, lighter wagon for the women. The sun was just beginning to spill over the jagged ridgeline when they departed, the wagon wheels groaning under the weight of an unspoken mission. They journeyed in a profound quietude through sparse woodlands and across rolling plains. Yet as the days bled one into the next, Elias began to assemble the fragments of their story. Their narrative unfolded not in words, but in sketches traced in the dust with a stick, in the sharp intake of breath when they saw a familiar landmark, and the shared glances across a dying fire. The squirrel-tail talismans were, as he had suspected, emblems of honor. They were hunters, guardians. Their people had dwelled in seclusion for generations,
hidden from the encroaching world of settlers, thriving deep within the mountain valleys. But their isolation had been shattered. Outsiders had come. Men with steel traps, with fire, with an insatiable greed. They brought not only weapons, but also disease and a pervasive fear. The tribe had been forced to flee, abandoning their sacred lands. In the chaos of their exodus, the tribe's leader, an elder woman who was the scarred warrior's mother, had vanished. Some whispered she was dead. Others held to the hope that she had remained behind as a decoy to lead the invaders astray. The three sisters had been separated from their kin during the turmoil, only to be captured and sold. Now, their sole purpose was to return, to find their people and to learn the fate of their matriarch. Elias grasped the gravity of their quest. If the land they once considered home was now overrun by these hostile men, their return would not be a joyful reunion. It would be a war. On the third night, with the fire crackling and the distant howls of coyotes echoing in the dark, Elias finally spoke. "Why me?" he asked, his voice rough. The eldest sister gazed into the flames, then met his eyes. She took a piece of charcoal from the fire, and on a flat rock drew a simple pictograph. A figure floating in a swirling river, and 3 other figures standing on the bank. She tapped his chest, then her own, then gestured toward the star-dusted sky. A debt repaid was not an ending, it was a beginning. By the 5th day, the landscape grew hostile. The trees pressed in, casting long, menacing shadows, and an unnatural silence fell. The birds had ceased their singing. The trail was littered with signs of disturbance, freshly broken branches, smoldering embers of a recent campfire, and most disturbingly, the carcasses of animals, expertly skinned, their bones left to bleach in the sun. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was not the work of hunters. This was the work of cruelty, the kind he had seen in the eyes of men who killed for sport and reveled in the act. On the 6th evening, they discovered their first real clue. A single totem had been driven into the earth, a spiral of bones, feathers, and squirrel tails. It was a tribal marker, placed within the last few days. The women approached it with a quiet reverence, the youngest weeping softly. It was a sign. Their people had passed this way. They were close. The next morning, they crested a plateau that offered a view of a small, concealed canyon. What they saw below sent a chill down Elias's spine. A crude encampment of tents and cook fires was nestled amongst the rocks, surrounded by a perimeter of traps and cages. Men armed with rifles patrolled the area. And inside the largest cage, he could make out human forms. Some still, others stirring weakly. They were members of the tribe, captured. It was the same kind of cage that had once held the sisters. The old fire of righteous fury surged within him, a potent mix of rage, guilt, and an undeniable sense of purpose. He had been saved once. It was now his turn to save others. But they could not afford a reckless charge. Their enemy was numerous, well-armed, and utterly ruthless. That night, the 4 of them huddled around a small, smokeless fire, using stones and twigs to map out the canyon floor and the dirt. The eldest would lead a silent assault from the western cliff face. The youngest, armed with only a blade, would circle around through a narrow gully. The middle sister would provide cover with her bow and signal the attack. Elias's role was the most dangerous. He would be the bait, walking into the open to draw their fire and attention. He did not hesitate. By the time the first light of dawn touched the sky, the plan was set. Every movement was calculated. The stakes were far greater than mere survival. This was about justice. As dawn spilled over the rocky crags of the canyon, a breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Elias hunkered behind a jagged boulder, his eyes narrowed as he surveyed the poachers' camp. Below, men moved about with a brutish languor, laughing, sharpening knives. The cages were shrouded in the morning mist, but the figures within were distinct. Tribal men, women, and children, their eyes hollow with despair. These men had no honor, no conscience, only a ravenous appetite for destruction. Elias adjusted the brim of his hat and stepped out from behind the rock.
He held no weapon, only the silver chain of his father's watch swinging from his vest. He strode directly toward the camp, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. A sentry on the ridge spotted him and yelled a warning. Rifles swiveled in his direction, voices rising in alarm. But Elias maintained his steady, unhurried pace, as if he hadn't a care in the world. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm lost," he shouted, his voice ringing in the morning quiet. "Not looking for trouble, just passing through." A man, clearly the leader, with his thick beard and mean, piggish eyes, emerged from the largest tent. "You're a long way from lost, cowboy. This ain't a place for wanderers." Elias offered a slow, disarming smile. "Is a man not allowed to stretch his legs?" The leader grunted and gestured with his hand. Instantly, 2 rifles were leveled at Elias's chest. He raised his hand slowly. "Easy now, just thought we might discuss some business." The distraction was all they needed. From the cliffs high above, the eldest sister let out the piercing cry of a hawk. It was the signal. Chaos erupted. From the west, the youngest sister dropped into the gully like a phantom, her knife a silver flash in the gloom, slitting the throat of the guard nearest the cages before he could utter a sound. From the ridge, the middle sister loosed an arrow that found its mark in a man's shoulder, spinning him around with a strangled cry. A powder keg, which the sisters had discreetly placed near a fire earlier, exploded with a deafening roar, sending smoke and panic through the camp. The poachers scattered, firing blindly into the cliffs, their discipline shattered. Elias dove behind a stack of crates, pulling the rifle he had concealed under his long coat. He fired a single, clean shot, taking down a man who was running toward the cages. More of the captors fell, some to arrows, others to the swift, silent blades of the tribe. In the heart of the confusion, the eldest sister reached the cages and began smashing the locks. Cries of hope and fury erupted from within as the captured tribe members surged out. It was no longer a battle, it was a reclamation. Years of suppressed fear and grief exploded in that moment as the tribe fought back with the ferocity of cornered animals. The poachers, caught completely off guard, attempted a hasty retreat. Elias moved with them, firing, ducking, providing cover for the escaping families. He found himself fighting back to back with the eldest sister, facing down a hulking brute wielding a massive iron hook. The man charged, but as Elias stepped left, the sister moved right, driving her spear deep into his chest. He collapsed without a sound. When the smoke finally settled, a stunned silence descended upon the canyon. Bodies were strewn across the ground, poachers and tribespeople alike. The survivors stood in a wide, ragged circle, panting, bleeding, but alive. Elias scanned the scene. The cages were empty. The fires were dying. The battle was won. But a cold certainty settled in his soul. This was not the end. Later that night, the tribe gathered at the canyon's edge. Controlled fires burned in circles, casting a warm golden glow on their weary faces. The freed villagers tended to the wounded with poultices of herbs. Children, once silent with terror, now clung to their mothers. The air was filled with a low murmur of gratitude and the soft, rhythmic beat of a single drum. The sisters sat with Elias, who nursed a deep gash on his forearm. For the first time, the eldest sister spoke to him in English, her words careful but clear. "Thank you." "You remember?" Elias asked, staring into the flames. "I never forgot." She nodded. Then she rose and retrieved a carved bone necklace from a leather pouch, the symbol of her tribe's leader. She extended it toward him, but then hesitated. Instead, she turned and walked into the crowd of survivors. From the throng emerged an older woman, her body bent and her face a road map of time and suffering, but her eyes blazed with an unquenchable fire. It was the missing matriarch. She had endured.
hidden, wounded, but alive. A wave of joyous relief washed through the people. The sisters rushed to embrace her, their reunion a powerful tableau of silent tears and renewed strength. Elias stood apart, an observer, a ghost drifting through a scene that was not his own. He had repaid his debt. He had helped them find one another. But as he turned to slip away into the darkness, the eldest sister's voice stopped him. "You leave?" she asked.
Elias paused. "I don't belong here." She tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "You saved us. You fight with us. You stay." The wind whispered through the pines, and for the first time in years, Elias felt a sense of peace. Not the empty peace of solitude, but the profound peace that is earned through fire and kinship. He looked at the matriarch's necklace she now wore, then up at the canopy of stars. The world beyond this canyon was still a threat, but here in this moment there was purpose. There was a place for him. He gave a single nod. "I'll stay. For a while." Weeks turned into months. The tribe established a temporary settlement in a defensible corner of the canyon, not far from Elias's ranch. The wounded healed, and the sound of children's laughter returned to the air. The sisters took it upon themselves to train the younger generation in the arts of tracking, hunting, and self-defense. Elias worked alongside them, his practical skills invaluable in repairing shelters, fortifying their position, and hunting for game with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew the land as an extension of himself. A slow, sturdy trust began to grow, not just between him and the sisters, but with the entire tribe. One morning, Elias stood with the tribe's matriarch on a cliff overlooking the valley. "They need a permanent home," she said, her voice a low rumble, speaking more to the wind than to him. "But the world out there, it does not welcome our kind." Elias followed her gaze to the sprawling plains beyond. "Perhaps not the world, but there is land, and I have more than I can manage alone." She turned to him, her ancient eyes holding both a deep-seated suspicion and a nascent gratitude. "You offer your land to strangers?" He shook his head. "I'm offering it to family." That evening a council was convened around the central fire. Elias spoke plainly, without flourish. He would deed a portion of his ranch to the tribe. This was not charity, nor was it a sale. It was to be a union, a place where they could build something new together, a sanctuary where no one would ever have to run again. His proposal was met with a profound, stunned silence. Then the youngest sister broke the stillness with a loud, unrestrained laugh, as sharp and joyful as the crackle of firewood. Soon others joined in. The old warriors nodded their solemn approval. The matriarch raised her hand, her voice ringing with conviction, and declared it the will of fate. Work began at first light. Logs were felled and hauled, clay bricks were molded and fired, and a watchtower was erected on the highest ridge. The old barn was repurposed into a great hall. The sisters and Elias led the tireless effort. He had grown close to all three, but it was the eldest he often found himself beside in the late hours, sharing stories of their different worlds, or simply working in a comfortable silence. She remained a woman of few words, but when she smiled, the memory of it lingered with him long after she had gone. Not everyone embraced this change. Word of their alliance spread to the nearby towns. Whispers slithered through saloons and general stores. Elias Thorne, the stubborn, solitary rancher, had taken in a tribe of savages and given away his birthright. Wagons that once traveled their road now took a longer route. Supplies from town became harder to procure. But Elias was unmoved. He had stared down floods and faced armed men. Malicious gossip was a foe he would not dignify with fear. One afternoon, a rider arrived from Fort Claiborne, bearing a message. The army had received reports of a large tribal gathering and demanded a meeting. Elias rode to the fort alone, his rifle left at the ranch, his resolve his only weapon. He was met at the gates by a colonel with a starched uniform and an expression of undisguised contempt. "We will not tolerate any native unrest in this territory," the colonel stated bluntly. "You are harboring people who have evaded our jurisdiction." Elias offered a cool, thin smile. "You mean the people you never bothered to help? The ones who are hunted, enslaved, and nearly exterminated while under your jurisdiction?" The colonel's eyes narrowed to slits. "Tread carefully, Thorne.
You are not above the law." Elias took a step closer. "Neither are you, Colonel. You have your orders, and I have my land, and these people do not belong to you."
That night, back at the ranch, he sat with the eldest sister beneath the vast, star-strewn sky. "They'll come for us eventually," he said, his voice low, "with laws or with guns." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her satchel and drew out a small object he had not seen in years, a simple ring he had carved from wood, shaped like a hawk in flight. "You gave this to me," she said softly, "after we saved you." He stared at it, and a memory flooded back, of wet hair, flickering firelight, and his own trembling hands. He had given it to her as a token of thanks when he was still too weak to speak. She had kept it all this time. "I never forgot you," she whispered. "Not when they chained us, not when they sold us like livestock." Elias leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "I never stopped looking. I just didn't know who I was looking for until I saw those squirrel tails." A rare, genuine smile touched her lips. "I thought you were dead." He let out a soft, humanless laugh. "In some ways, I was." In the weeks that followed, they worked with a renewed urgency. Scouts were posted and traps were set along the outer perimeter. The people were learning to live not just as a tribe, but as a unified defense force. Horses were trained to act as sentinels. Every night, the stars looked down upon a community growing stronger, more resilient. But a storm was gathering on the horizon, and Elias could feel the coming pressure in his bones. The storm arrived not with thunder and lightning, but with the tramp of boots and the glint of rifles in the morning sun. At dawn, 3 companies of hired men descended upon them, not uniformed soldiers, but hard-eyed mercenaries. They carried forged documents claiming federal authority, accusing the tribe of trespassing and Elias of harboring fugitives. They demanded immediate surrender. The man leading them was a rancher named Cartwright, a railroad magnate and the very same brute who had bid on the sisters at the auction months before. He dismounted before their newly erected gate and spat into the dust. "You should have stayed in your house, Thorne. Now you're going to lose it all." Elias stood firm behind the barricade, a rifle in his hands, but not yet raised. "This land is mine. These people are my family. You want it, you'll have to come through me." Cartwright sneered. "Gladly." What ensued was not a battle, but a siege. For days, the mercenaries circled the ranch like vultures, cutting off supply routes, attempting to starve them into submission. But Elias had learned from the tribe, and they had learned from the land. They used hidden ravines to access a spring, secret trails to forage for food. The young warriors, moving like ghosts between the rocks, launched lightning raids to distract the enemy and sabotage their supplies. Through it all, Elias and the eldest sister, who now shared his rebuilt stone house, held the community together. He no longer had to lead, he fought as one of them. On the 6th day, they launched their counterattack, a night raid, silent as the falling mist. 24 fighters, Elias among them, encircled the mercenary camp. At the signal, a hawk's cry, they descended. Fires were extinguished, wagons overturned, weapons seized. Elias cornered Cartwright near a splintered tree, tackling him and pinning him in the mud. "You don't belong here," Cartwright hissed, spitting dirt. Elias didn't waste words. He just knocked him unconscious. By morning, the enemy was broken. Some had surrendered, others had fled into the hills. The tribe had won. Blood had been shed, but losses were minimal, a few wounds, a few bruises. The cost could have been infinitely higher. That night, the fire in the great hall burned high, but the mood was somber, not celebratory. They had survived another trial, but they all knew it was far from over. Word of this would spread. More would come, not mercenaries next time, but lawyers, judges, and perhaps even the army. The tribe had always existed in the shadows. Now they were standing in the full light of the sun. Elias looked at the eldest sister. "We have to make this place legitimate, recognized." She met his gaze and nodded. "Then we build something the law cannot tear down." And so the next chapter began. Elias rode into town, but this time he was not alone. Half the tribe rode with him, a silent, dignified procession. The townsfolk stared, some stepping back, but no one dared to speak. He entered the county office, hat in hand, and laid his documents on the counter. The deeds, the tax records, the ledgers of ownership. "This land is mine," he told the nervous clerk, "and this community is under my protection." The clerk stammered about regulations and politics, but he accepted the papers. It was a beginning. Weeks became months. The fortifications were strengthened. New wells were dug. A schoolhouse was built upon the foundation of Elias's old storage barn, where the children of the tribe learned their letters alongside the sons of his ranch hands. The sisters trained the women in archery and self-defense, while Elias taught carpentry, irrigation, and how to mend a broken plow. They did not assimilate in the conventional sense. They forged something new, a hybrid culture born of mutual respect and shared struggle. The eldest sister now carried herself with a quiet authority, no longer silent, but speaking with purpose, guiding her people with a steady hand. Her hand often rested on Elias's shoulder in the evenings, and when new storms threatened, they faced them as one. There was no formal proposal, no wedding ceremony. One morning she stood beside him on the ridge, looking out at their burgeoning village, and said, "We are yours, and you are ours." He nodded. "Then that's enough." Whispers of trouble still lingered, but now they had allies. Other tribes, hearing of what Elias and his community had built, sent emissaries. Some came to trade, others to seek refuge. The nearby towns slowly began to thaw, especially after their blended farming methods. Elias's knowledge, combined with the tribe's ancestral wisdom, produced crops that thrived, while a blight wiped out half the county's herds. Cartwright resurfaced, limping and bitter, attempting to press charges, but public opinion had turned. The newspapers now painted Elias as a folk hero, a man who had built a haven in the wilderness. One article read, "From flood survivor to protector of the displaced, Elias Thorne has defied both convention and law to carve a peace from chaos." The governor never visited, but he sent a letter bearing a heavy wax seal. In it, he designated the settlement a recognized autonomous community under state protection. It was not full sovereignty, but it was a shield. Elias hung the letter in the great hall. Above it hung the squirrel-tail talismans of the three sisters, now faded with time. Beside it, a new carving had been added, the figures of a man and a woman standing together beneath a great tree, their arms open. Time flowed on, and the land remembered. What had once been a solitary ranch was now a thriving, layered community. Wooden pathways connected cabins, smoke curled from shared kitchens, and children of all backgrounds ran barefoot where barbed wire fences once stood. The tribe had not just survived, they had been reborn in strength, and with them a new kind of settler. Men who had once sneered now brought offerings of tools and seeds. Women who had once averted their eyes now traded herbal remedies and shared recipes at harvest festivals. Elias watched it all, never quite comfortable with the title of leader. He wore no special adornments, held no seat of honor at the council. He was simply the man who had stayed, and for that he was revered. The elders constructed a stone circle in his name, a place for gathering and listening. He hadn't asked for it, but on the first day of winter, as the entire village gathered within the circle, the eldest sister stood and told the story of the half-drowned boy who had come to them, and how he had never turned away from what he did not understand. Then with a simple touch to his hand, she guided him to the center. There were no speeches, only a respectful hush that fell like the first snow. He nodded once, looked at the faces around him, and said, "We've built something the world doesn't know how to name, but we know what it is. And that's enough." But life never truly rests. That spring, a message arrived from the state capitol, an invitation to a legislative hearing. Powerful interests were petitioning to seize his land under a new development initiative. The council's decision was immediate and unanimous. He would go, and he would not go alone. When Elias rode into the capital city weeks later, he was accompanied by 12 tribal leaders, 3 wagons of meticulously kept records, and a young translator who had mastered the arcane language of the law.
They walked into the hallowed halls not as supplicants or relics, but as an organized, articulate delegation.
The hearing was long and fraught with tension, but the translator stood tall, reciting their history. One of the sisters presented records of every crop harvested, every tax paid, every mouth fed. Finally, Elias took the stand. He did not plead. He spoke as a man who had built something with his bare hands and dared the world to tear it down. The ruling came after hours of deliberation. The settlement would remain. Furthermore, it would be granted regional recognition as a protected cultural and agricultural district. It was a victory, a declaration that they existed and they mattered. He returned to find lanterns lighting the ridge and the soft echo of drums on the wind. He simply raised one hand, and they erupted, not in cheers, but in a low, rhythmic song from the old language, a song of resilience now reborn under new stars. Years passed. Elias's hair turned to silver. His stride lost its urgency, but the village never faltered. It grew, adding schools, workshops, and greenhouses. The sisters aged with him, each a respected elder in her own right. The eldest bore a daughter with her mother's sharp eyes and quiet smile, a child who followed Elias everywhere, learning not from books but from his gentle treatment of the land, the animals, and the people. One morning, Elias sat beneath the great tree they had planted after the siege. He watched the children play, heard the distant call of a hunting horn, and smelled baking bread. The world was not perfect, but it was immeasurably better than it had been. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his years not as a burden, but as a well-worn, comforting quilt. When he passed, they did not bury him in a marked grave. They laid him to rest in the grove by the creek where he had once collapsed, forgotten by the world. The sisters wrapped his body in a deerskin cloak, embroidered with tribal symbols of the seasons. The eldest placed a lock of her own graying hair upon his chest and whispered words in her native tongue, sealing the earth above him with her own hands. A simple ring of stones was placed there, not to mark a hero, but to honor a man who remained. No plaque, no statue, just a tree that grew beside the creek, nourished by the same water that had once delivered him to them. His story was told not in lessons but through the lives the people lived, the peace they kept, the justice they pursued, the way they opened their gates to strangers. Over time, others came, survivors of raids, victims of greed, runaways seeking a place that would not turn them away. The community welcomed them, just as they had once welcomed Elias. The village grew not into a town or a city, but into something more powerful, a living memory, where every house was built on a foundation of trust and every stranger offered the chance for a new beginning. Decades later, when the maps had been redrawn and names forgotten, a single phrase remained in the old dialect, a name whispered by the fire during storytelling, the one who was given and who gave in return. That was Elias Thorne's true legacy.